Alright, today's video is going to be a little bit longer than usual. It's because I want to talk about a couple things, and I also would like to get into some technical stuff. And if you're not really interested in that and you just want to see something getting built, feel free to skip ahead. I will leave you the time down below in the video description so you don't have to click through the video like a maniac. Okay, let's get started. When I tell people that I built a tiny houseboat, one of their very first questions always is, on which leg are you going to launch the boat? And each time I hear that question, I know right away that I haven't explained well enough what my idea is. Like most people, especially around BC, they have a certain picture in mind, a picture of a swimming mansion located permanently on one lake. Well, that's not exactly what I'm after. To explain better what I got in mind, let me show you those two boats. A couple years ago, I found a video from a YouTuber. His name is Roy Schreier. I have no clue how to pronounce that. Sorry, Roy, if I butchered that. But he built this super cool tiny houseboat, the Diana's Rose, and I was quite inspired by his design. And then I also found the Cara Boat, and Cara Boat is a company I think in the US that produces really beautiful, luxurious tiny houseboats. Now, what both of them have in common is that both of them are very easy to haul around in a trailer. You're basically looking at a camper trailer that is floatable at this point. And that's what I want. I want something super flexible, something that I might launch for a couple days, but then I move on to the next lake. And we live in Canada, and Canada has more lakes than all the other countries in this world together. So what better place to be than Canada to do this? Now, I won't be able to just buy a Cara boat because I don't have the money, otherwise I would do that. I think they start at 140,000 US dollar. So they're quite expensive, but I thought I might be able to do something in between Roy's DIY houseboat and the luxurious Cara boat. That's what I'm gonna try anyways. So there's one more thing worth mentioning while I'm talking about how I want to utilize this boat in the future, and that is the hull shape. There are a lot of different hull shapes out there. All of them come with pros and cons. I decided for a flat bottom hull for multiple reasons. For one, it's extremely stable in calm water. It also has a really shallow draft. I'm assuming this boat will have a draft of 6 to 8 inch. That's really not a lot, and it will come in handy when you get close to the shore and will help to prevent damage. It also allows you to access shallow water in general. And besides all of that, a flat bottom hull is somewhat easy to construct in comparison to other hull shapes, and it's also quite spacious, so that will help me to utilize as much interior space as possible. It has one big downside though, and that is rough water. And that's the main reason why this boat will never see the ocean. It's just not really meant for this. The hull shape is not really good in choppy water. And I even have to be careful in bigger lakes because at times they can get pretty rough too. Good thing I have so many to choose from. A couple of weeks ago, I got asked by multiple people about my plans regarding the Bildgewater, what I'm gonna do about the Bildgewater. And to answer that question, I will have to dive in a little bit deeper. So let's take a closer look at what Bildgewater actually is and where does it come from. Alright, now Bildgewater is basically water, mostly dirty water, that collects under the floor on the lowest point of a boat's or ship's inner hull. The bigger question, however, is where does it come from? Well, it can come from multiple sources. One would be, for example, a leaking propeller or rudder shaft packing. And it really doesn't take much, just a couple drops an hour. They can accumulate over time to something quite serious. The same goes for through hull fittings. Those are fittings that penetrate the hull, for example, to drain a sink or to serve as an inlet and outlet for water-cooled inboard motors, or just a simple drain plug in smaller boats, just to name a few. Another source would be quite literally a damaged or leaking hull. Maybe you hit something hard enough and now you're taking on water, or maybe you try to attach something with bolts and screws and that's where you experience a leak. A more obvious source might be a leaking window and overhead hatches. Also, any kind of onboard water system, such as your fresh and gray water tank and the shower, they might have a slow leak somewhere, maybe on a hose clamp, or maybe you have a damaged hose. And then, of course, there's condensation. You might have humid air from having a shower, from boiling some water, from cooking, or maybe just from being in your boat. A human body produces a certain amount of humidity by sweating and breathing. That humidity can condensate on cold surfaces and can accumulate to a shocking amount of water. Maybe you have an air conditioner and experience something that is called air conditioner sweating. That occurs when humid air makes contact with the cold surface of the ducted air conditioner grill. Okay, well, this is quite a versatile list we got going on here. Now let's put this in correlation with the boat that I'm building. Right away I can delete the first point completely because I simply don't plan on having an inboard motor. So there's no packing for a rudder shaft or a propeller shaft. The same goes for the through hull fittings. I don't plan on having a single through hull fitting. I just don't want to have a single hole in this hull. So that won't matter to me either. Next on the list, we got the issues you potentially could have with the hull itself. And let me show you real quick how I constructed the hull. So I got my Douglas fir frame that I covered with 3/8 of an inch marine grade plywood. And the plywood was covered with multiple layers of 6-ounce woven fiberglass and epoxy. That basically waterproofed the hull right there. Then I installed 2 3-inch keels made from cedar on the bottom, and instead of screwing or bolting them on, I went to quite some effort to glue it on with thickened epoxy first, and then I also fiberglassed them over just to avoid any penetration of the hull. After that I used 4 coats of epoxy primer and multiple coats of marine grade paint. Now the keel is the part of the boat that is most likely to be damaged on impact with the ground, so even if I damage it, there's really no way for the water to enter the hull, unless of course I hit the hull itself. But not only would it take a massive impact to do some serious damage, which is hard to do with the small outboard that I'm planning to use, but also there is a risk that is simply unavoidable in general, no matter what kind of boat you use. What I'm trying to explain here is that I have complete trust in the water tightness of the hull, and I'm not afraid of any potential small leak or damage, because it's very unlikely considering all the factors. And keep in mind, this camper boat mix will live most of its life probably on a trailer, not in the water, since I might launch it for a couple days, maybe a week at a time. But there will be plenty of time in between to do a visual inspection and to detect any damage and to deal with it right away before it becomes a bigger problem. So this point is not valid in my case. How about the windows and the overhead hatches? Well, I don't have an overhead hatch that leads to the interior. I do have a big opening in the ceiling for a fan, and I do have 6 windows, so there is some realistic potential for a leak. But at this point we are basically talking about a little bit of rainwater leaking in. That is not going to be enough to accumulate to a couple centimeters of bilge water on its own. And besides that, I most likely would notice that, and that would give me the chance to do something about it. Now that is a different story though with the onboard water system. All of this is going to be tucked away under this raised floor, and by the time I would notice a leak, it might already cause some serious problems. Now in order to prevent that, I plan on using those water leak alarm sensors. Those things run on 9 volt, and I'm gonna place multiple of them under the foam right on the lowest point possible. And that way I should be alarmed as soon as a leak develops. So I don't really have to worry about that either. Alright, there's just one more left on the list, and unfortunately the last one is kind of tricky to deal with. Now, humidity and condensation is pretty much guaranteed to happen, but there are still things that can be done to avoid the accumulation of condensation water in the bilge. And one of them is to rely on a really dry heat source during cold periods. Have you ever tried one of those body heaters in a tent or in a camper? If so, you probably notice the high humidity in the room or the unusual amount of condensation on the tent walls or the windows. And that's because those unvented propane heaters produce about 1 pound of water vapor for every pound of propane that they burn. That's a significant amount. Now I'm probably going to install multiple heat sources, but one of them is guaranteed a wood stove because it's a really comfortable and dry heat. Even more important though is ventilation. Now, ironically, the entire boat is built to be as watertight as possible, but that also means that water vapor on the inside can't just dry up from the inside out. I literally need air exchange to get rid of that humidity. Now, I will be able to open some of those windows, but that is not going to be enough, and that's why I will install a fan. And that fan should be able to pull out all the air by simply pressing a button. Now, with all those measures in place, I'm afraid there still could be some condensation. Now, let's find out where exactly that condensation is going to happen. Now, let's pretend for a second we could look at this crosscut of the boat through the lens of an infrared camera. Because all of the walls will be insulated with R10 GPS foam insulation, they probably would appear in those warmer colors. The bottom of the boat might be slightly cooler than the top, but still somewhat warm. Now let's add the cold sections. You can see that the coldest spot will be right at the windows, and that is because the single pane windows provide next to no insulation. And that is exactly where the humid air will condensate. Am I in trouble now? Well, I don't think so. I actually welcome the fact that I will get condensation on the windows. That may sound strange, but I'd much rather know exactly where it happens versus having an uninsulated shell where condensation can happen randomly and undetected pretty much everywhere. And I speak from experience. I used to live for a certain period of my life in a motorhome, and in the winter, every morning I had to go around and collect with a rag all those little droplets on the windows. Literally just took 1 minute and wasn't that big of a deal. And hey, at least my windows were clean. But more important is the rest of the interior stayed bone dry, and I didn't even have ventilation back then. Now, what is the conclusion of all of this? Bottom line is, I don't expect any bilge water. I know this will leave many in disbelief. After all, probably 95% of the boats out there experience bilge water. My grandfather used to run for a boat rental for almost 65 years with give or take 30 boats, and I personally don't remember a single one not having water in it. But in my opinion, we are comparing now apples to bananas, and they're both fruits, but they taste quite different. Anyways, I also think it would be quite irresponsible to head out there for a couple of days without being prepared for the worst. So there will be some form of 12-volt pump for sure, but no bilge water system in a traditional sense. It would be kind of hard to implement anyways, since the lowest point of the boat is spread over the entire surface. I hope I was able to explain my thoughts with my poor English. I encourage you to take everything I said with a grain of salt. After all, those are just my thoughts and it's my opinion. I'm really tired of talking now, so let's go and build something. Alright, now my plan is to install some sort of a pocket door in the rear end of the boat. That is easier said than done. Let's pretend for a second this is a door. Traditionally, it would have hinges on one side, and the door would pivot along just that one axis. So that is somewhat of an easy movement to lock and also easy to seal. That's a different story though with a pocket door. A pocket door slides from the left to right, but since it just has those two attachment points, it also can swing. Now traditionally that's prevented by two stops at the bottom on the pocket, and the door wouldn't come out all the way, and those two stops would prevent most of the swinging movement. Not all, but who cares? Pocket doors are just installed on the interior. They don't have to seal, they don't have to lock. Different story in my case though. And if you think about sliding doors, it's a different animal. They have a track on the bottom. I don't want to have a track on the bottom. It's a tripping hazard, one more spot that can accumulate dirt. So I came up with this thing. I didn't film this because this would have taken forever and there was a lot of fiddling around, but let me show you how this works. Bolt in here. This is a chunk of spring. This piece of steel here. Alright, so now I have this piece of steel that can pivot around the bolt and is under some tension through the spring here. I also have this little cutout, and this whole assembly is supposed to be in the door. And this part here is supposed to be on the door frame. So if my pocket door comes sliding out, it will latch into this part. So now the left and right movement is prevented. But if we assemble this even further and look from the top at it, then you can see once it's locked, those tapered edges on the wood here prevent the left and right movement as well. Now, I have absolutely no clue if this really works. It works in my brain, but that's not always reality. So I guess we have to build a door now and figure that one out. Now, the first thing I have to do is to build the door frame, and I decided to use this old weathered Douglas fir board for this. This is much more time consuming than just buying lumber, but it's also a lot cheaper since I had it already, and it's very satisfying to be able to give material a second life. Now that the frame was done, I could work on the paneling. And I used some recycled material for this. Yet again, thank you, Drew, for donating this stuff. This is old cedar paneling from a sauna. It's super light, just a 1/4 of an inch thick, and yet it has a tongue and groove. I just ran it for a very light pass through the planer to clean up the surface, and then I started to glue them into the frame. Once I was done with one side, I flipped the door around and started to fill the cavities with foam. That was a good opportunity to use up all the scrap pieces I had kicking around. Since the entire door is already a little unusual, I decided to experiment with the look, and I used some chrome trim that is usually used on the interior of a car, and I hammered that in the edge between paneling and frame. You can get this stuff on Amazon for about $8 Canadian, and you get over 16 feet. And of course it depends on your personal taste, but I think it turned out great, and the door looks now like $1,000, which is kind of ironic considering that I paid next to nothing other than for the trim, the hardware for the pocket door track, and some weather strip. I used 2 lines of that on the bottom of the door, and I actually had to trim them with scissors a little bit to make sure I had enough room for some flooring later on. I built this trim for the door frame off camera. It is made out of a solid piece of Douglas fir. I just hollowed it out with a router and finished it with water-based polyurethane. That step alone took me almost an entire day. It's kind of crazy how long it takes to make things from scratch instead of just buying them. And that is part of the reason why this is such a long-term project. I'm building this on a pretty small budget, and I try not to go in debt for this, but it also means I have to recycle as much material as I possibly can, which is, after all, really very satisfying. Now, I'm not sure if this is visible on the video, but it turned out that the door latch worked just as I imagined. The tapered edges really pull the door snug against the frame, even if it comes swinging in off-center, so I'm calling this a success.